two men lay in total darkness at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. They had 12 minutes of oxygen left. The submersible Pisces 3 weighed 13 tons. It sat on the seabed 575 feet below the surface. That is deeper than the Empire State Building is tall. The date was August 29, 1973. Roger Mallinson and Roger Chapman were laying a transatlantic telephone cable. They worked for Vickers Oceanics out of Barrow-in-Furness in England. Their vessel was a tiny yellow sphere made of steel less than an inch thick. Most of the submersible was a cramped 6-foot diameter pressure hull. Two grown men shared a space smaller than a phone booth. The water temperature outside was just above freezing. The air inside their capsule was already running low. They had been on the seabed for nearly 10 hours of routine work. Their assignment was finished. The support ship Vickers Voyager began to recover the submersible. A cable attached to the Pisces III started pulling it toward the surface. Then the aft hatch failed catastrophically. A metal latch snapped with a silent underwater crack. Water flooded into the rear machinery compartment. The submersible inverted and began sinking out of control. Mallinson and Chapman were thrown against the curved steel walls. Their tools and equipment cascaded around them in the darkness. The submersible tumbled backward toward the abyss. It struck the seabed with a deafening impact. The lights flickered once and went out. Silence filled the tiny sphere except for the sound of dripping water. Roger Mallinson reached for a flashlight in the dark. His hand found cold steel and wet wiring. Roger Chapman checked the depth gauge with trembling fingers. The needle pointed past the 500-foot mark. No rescue had ever been attempted at this depth. They were beyond every safety margin ever written. But what happened next was even more terrifying. A sharp chemical smell began filling the cramped cabin. Seawater had mixed with the lithium hydroxide canisters. The chemical reaction was eating their oxygen supply. Mallinson did the math in his head. 72 hours until the air became unbreathable. Their emergency beacon was transmitting a faint signal to the surface. The crew of the Vickers Voyager heard it immediately. They also knew exactly what it meant. Two men were alive on the ocean floor in an unforgiving darkness. A frantic call went out across the Atlantic. Vickers Oceanics had only two other submersibles in the entire world. Pisces 2 was stationed in Scotland. Pisces V was in Canada. Both were ordered to move with maximum urgency. The Royal Navy dispatched the HMS Hecate to the search zone. The United States Navy diverted a C-141 Starlifter cargo plane. It flew Pisces V from Vancouver to Ireland in a single overnight flight. The Royal Canadian Air Force loaded Pisces 2 onto a transport aircraft. Every minute counted against an invisible clock on the ocean floor. On the seabed, Mallinson and Chapman did the only thing they could. They waited in complete silence and total darkness. They could hear their own heartbeats inside the steel sphere. The temperature inside the capsule dropped relentlessly toward freezing. Their breaths condensed into fog on the curved steel walls. Water pooled at the bottom of the sphere from condensation and small leaks. They sat in icy water up to their waists. They did not speak much. They knew every word consumed oxygen. Chapman wrote a letter to his wife on a waterproof notepad in the dark. He pressed pencil to paper by feel alone. The letter was a goodbye he hoped she would never read. Above them, a massive international rescue fleet assembled. The Vickers Voyager used sonar to pinpoint the Pisces 3 on the seafloor. The signal was weak and ghost-like at that depth. A recovery line had to be lowered precisely onto the submersible. 1,000 feet of steel cable spun downward through the black water. Surface ships coordinated their positions with agonizing precision. Currents at depth twisted the cable into unpredictable shapes. The first attempt missed by 20 feet. The second attempt tangled in the submersible's broken machinery. 52 hours had now passed since the hatch failed. Mallinson and Chapman had been breathing the same air for 3 days. The carbon dioxide level inside the sphere was approaching lethal concentrations. Both men were hallucinating in the cold and darkness. Chapman saw the faces of his children in the condensation on the walls. Mallinson heard music playing from somewhere inside the steel hull. The lithium hydroxide scrubbers were saturated and useless. The air grew thick and heavy like breathing through a wet blanket. Every inhale was a deliberate act of survival. Then the cable found its target. A remotely operated grappling hook latched onto the submersible's lifting point. The connection was confirmed by a strain gauge on the surface ship. The slowest elevator ride in human history began. The winch began turning at a rate of 10 feet per minute. At that speed, it would take nearly 3 hours to reach the surface. But the cable was not designed for this depth. It stretched and groaned under the unprecedented load. Engineers on the surface watched the tension meters with white knuckles. A snapped cable meant 2 dead men and an unrecoverable wreck. The submersible ascended through 7 pressure zones of the Atlantic. Each zone tested the damaged hull with increasing stress. A single crack in the steel sphere meant instant implosion. The water pressure at 500 feet was over 650 pounds per square inch. That is enough to crush a human body into the size of a football. Mallinson pressed his ear to the hull, listening for the sound of failing steel. He heard nothing but his own breathing and the creak of the lifting cable. Chapman stared at the depth gauge, watching the needle move impossibly slowly. 500 feet from the surface, the cable began shedding its outer sheath. Tons of steel wire unspooled under the strain. Engineers feared the inner core would snap at any second. 200 feet, 100 feet. The submersible breached the surface like a corpse returning from the grave. The crew of the Vickers Voyager cheered from the deck of the recovery ship, but the hatch was still sealed and the sphere was still a tomb. Rescue divers hit the water within seconds. They hammered on the steel hull with a wrench. From inside the sphere, they heard 3 faint taps in reply. Both men were alive. A cutting torch opened the damaged hatch in 30 agonizing seconds. Cold Atlantic air rushed into the sphere for the first time. In over 3 days, Mallinson's face appeared in the hatch, opening gaunt and gray. Chapman was pulled out behind him, barely conscious and shivering violently. Engineers later calculated the remaining oxygen would have lasted 12 more minutes. 12 minutes. 72 hours of isolation in the dark and the cold at the bottom of the Atlantic. And they were pulled out with 12 minutes of air left in the tank. No one has ever been rescued from a deeper place beneath the ocean. The Pisces 3 rescue rewrote every manual on deep-sea survival. It proved that humans could endure the most hostile environment on Earth. It proved that an entire hemisphere would mobilize to save 2 men in a steel ball. It proved that the line between life and death is sometimes made of cable and hope. Roger Mallinson kept a photo of his wife tucked inside his immersion suit. He looked at it once in the darkness and decided not to look again. He told himself he would see her in person or not at all. Roger Chapman's waterproof letter was never sent. He gave it to his wife years later, framed in a simple wooden box. She never read it. She said she did not need to read what she already understood. Both men returned to the ocean. Mallinson continued working as a submersible pilot for another 20 years. Chapman became a consultant on deep-sea rescue operations for navies around the world. Neither man ever spoke of fear when discussing what they endured. They spoke of the cold. They spoke of the darkness. They spoke of the silence that stretched between them like a third presence in the sphere. They spoke of the sound the wrench made when it tapped the hull from outside. It was not a rescue tool striking steel. It was the sound of the world above saying, "You are not forgotten." You are 1,575 feet down in total darkness with 12 minutes of air, and the world above is moving heaven and earth to find you.